OPEC seems to imply that its strong economic growth, including in China, continues to drive strong oil demand growth. The rest of the forecasters are more cautious, and they say that the growth is sort of flattening out. I personally would add a dimension which I don't see OPEC really paying much attention to, which is that we have efficiency improvements for decade after decade in the way we use oil. So in other words, you need less oil today to drive 100 miles. You need less oil to build a plastic bottle or plastic bag. You need less oil to fly a plane from A to B. These efficiency improvements are highly regular and highly globalized. They occur everywhere where oil is consumed. Now, when you do the numbers and you sit down and you just continue to assume the same efficiency improvements over the next 10 years or so, which we have seen the last 35 years, then you see oil demand peaking by 2029. And this has nothing to do with economic growth and has nothing to do with the energy transition. It is just the normal growth which we have always seen, plus the fact that we're getting better and better using a scarce resource like oil. That would leads me to think that OPEC is overly optimistic on its oil demand. And that is one of the underlying reasons why there's such a big gap between the forecast of OPEC and then the forecast of the International Energy Agency, of oil companies, of investment houses, which are all assuming that oil demand will peak or plateau within the next decade.
And Christof, this is going to have widespread implications for the transition. Also going back to what you said before, we are seeing a very significant reset of the narrative here when it comes to the energy transition. I think that begins at a political level, first of all. Obviously, a very, very different perspective on this, moving from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, and that has significant trickle-down effects globally. We're seeing this also being replicated among other governments worldwide, and indeed the foot being taken off the gas when it comes to the energy transition globally. Would you agree with that?
Yes, except it's not just political. It is really driven by technology. There is a shift in the narrative, and it's very important to recognize that. The old narrative, again, was a very simple one. It's like we have a problem. Scientists tell us there's too much emissions in the air. The emissions come from energy consumption. The emissions come really from fossil fuel combustion. So we have to stop fossil fuels, replace them with renewables, and we'll be fine. The new narrative says we need all fossil fuels and other things because we cannot immediately replace. You cannot even replace electricity from coal immediately with solar and wind, given our technologies, because of the intermittency problem, because sometimes there's no wind, sometimes there's no sun. So we have learned that technologically the simple narrative doesn't work, and for that reason we need fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. I'll give you an example. Hybrid cars. You know? Consumers want hybrid cars, not pure electric cars. In any markets, you give them a choice. And that is an example for how fossil and renewables can work together, but how one of them alone would probably, just electricity alone, would probably be too cumbersome to replace it. The same is true when you think about power generation. You want to replace coal, but in many instances, it's better to replace it with gas. And much too costly to replace it with wind or solar. And in many other circumstances, even a new dirty coal-fired power station can provide backup generation capacity for wind and solar when there is no wind and no sun, and therefore lower overall emissions. So we are learning that fossil fuels and renewables are complementary, and that we really need, as the phrase goes, all types of energy to work together, and we need to learn how to combine them most intelligently to minimize emissions. And in that game, fossil fuels have a role to play, independently of whether it's Democrats or Republicans running the U.S.
Indeed. And, you know, the narrative from the fossil fuel industry and indeed players within the OPEC group is that global energy demand will continue to rise. We are seeing the economies of China and India becoming increasingly energy intensive, and the energy mix is going to have to continue to diversify in order to meet that demand. So with that in mind, what do you think a realistic global energy mix is going to look like by 2040? For example, will we continue to see fossil fuels being a predominant driver of the energy mix, or will that diversification narrative, that diversification trend actually stay intact here?
So there's one thing which you cannot forecast, or nobody can forecast, which is if there's a technological breakthrough. So a new battery falls from the sky tomorrow and makes it possible to store energy. Bearing that, if we exclude these kind of unpredictable events, then I see by 2040 the world still dominated by fossil fuels. They are now 85–86% of the total, and they are still growing, and their share is shrinking only very, very gradually. And I don't see this changing given the technological options we have. I don't see this changing no matter how much political emphasis is put on the transition. On the other hand, one has to be a bit careful. OPEC, for example, seems to have no impact of electric cars in its oil demand, and so the share of fossil fuels may shrink, but in absolute terms, it will still be dominant, and the share also will still be larger than the share of renewables by 2040. I think that's pretty obvious in the numbers.